Let us have a short recap of the last video. In the last lesson, we saw that the narrator of the story went to stay in the guest house of Mr. and Mrs. Bhandari. He experienced the hospitality of the couples, and he had the admiration of their daughter and wanted to talk to her. But the little girl ran away with tears in her eyes. It was at this time that Mr. Bhandari revealed to the narrator that their daughter is deaf and dumb. Now let us see in this video what happened next. It did not take me long to see that this was a situation the poor parents had to put up with almost daily. For every day, one or two guests left and new ones came along. And at that very first meeting, or soon afterwards, they would run into the child, be fascinated by her charm and beauty, and want to talk to her, to pat her, and soon every time it would result in the child silently smiling, sighing, and withdrawing, leaving looks of agony on the faces of her parents. Often it would lead to lengthy explanations as to how the calamity had come about, for many of the inquisitive visitors liked to know if it was from birth or the result of an accident. Let's see the words that we need to learn. Run into means meet unexpectedly. Fascinated means captivated, spellbound. Withdrawing means retreating. Agony, pain, or distress. Calamity is a distress or tragedy. Inquisitive means the person is curious or interested. So the narrator realized that the parents faced this humiliation daily because every day new guests enter the house. The guests, when they meet the little girl, they wish to talk to her because they will be captivated by her charm and beauty. But the girls will never respond to them because she won't understand them. This daily happening will leave the poor parent sad and distressed. Sometimes the parent have to explain in details the behavior of their child. The queries were answered by the parents haltingly and with obvious anguish. What struck me as worst part of the situation was that the girl would be often gravely looking on, her eyes aghast with horror and self-pity. She did not go to school as there was none there to cater for her needs. They had tried to teach her at home, but without success. The words that we need to learn here are queries, that means questions or inquiries. Haltingly means nervously. Obvious, anguish or clear pain. Gravely means grimly or seriously. Aghast, horrified, shocked. Self-pity, excessive unhappiness over one's own troubles. Pastime means activity or hobby. Cater means serve or look after. So the guests had many questions about the girls, and the parents will nervously answer and explain to all their queries. And the worst part is that the girl too is being affected gravely by the presence of the guest who look at her with astonishment and sympathetic eyes. She did not go to school because there were no school around that catered to her special needs who are deaf and dumb. To save the child from such repeated humiliation, I one day suggested something to the Bhandaris, which the parents, after some trepidation, agreed to try. We decided to have bits of paper typed and to hand over one of these chits, duly sealed in a cover, to every new visitor as soon as he or she entered the guest house. The text of the chit ran, Our daughter is deaf and dumb. You may hurt her by trying to be friendly too soon, as she can neither understand nor reply to you kind words. You are requested to please give her time to approach you and make your acquaintance. Thank you. Mr. The words to learn first is humiliation, which means insult. Trepidation means alarm. Duly sealed, properly closed. Acquaintance means familiarity or contact. So here we have Mr. Nahim, who is very kind and thoughtful, wanted to help the parents to solve this unending mental and emotional suffering. So he came up with an idea, though the parents were apprehensive, were doubtful at the beginning. They were frightened what's going to happen at the end. They wanted to give a try. Their plan was to give a chit to every visitors who enter the house, explaining to them about the girl and asking them not to make friends too soon with the girl, but to give her time and space and wait for the girl to become friendly with them. A line to the effect that they might be spared questions about her was removed by Mr. Bhandari on the plea that it would not be compatible with her spirit of hospitality. As it was, she felt the note was not a very kind one to be given to people who were going to make her guest house their temporary home. But she gave consent to save the girl the untold misery and helplessness she experienced every time a stranger approached her. So the difficult words here that we need to learn are plea, a request made in an urgent and emotional manner. Compatible means suited to or in accord with. Untold misery means great unhappiness or distress. So here in the chit, there was a line written that the guest will not ask any explanation to the parents about the child. To this line, Mrs. Bhandari's, she requested to remove, for she felt that it doesn't agree with the spirit of her hospitality. She felt that the line was not very kind one to be given to the guest who will be staying in her house temporarily, that means for some time. She consented to this idea just to remove untold suffering and helplessness of her child whenever a stranger approached her. The ruse worked well, even beyond our expectation. Though a few sympathetic questions were still put to the parents, the poor child was spared. Later, the girl herself slowly became intimate with many of the guests, and the Bhandaris felt relieved and thought that at least one of their problem was temporarily solved. Their plan became successful now. The visitors does not go to the girls at once. Then the visitors wait for her to come. Then at times ask sympathetic questions from the parents. But the parents felt relieved as one of their problems was solved. So the words here that we learn are ruse, which means an action intended to deceive. Intimate means close. Relieved means no longer feeling distressed. Sympathetic means friendly, someone who shows care and concern. But they had a strange visitor one day. It was late in the afternoon, and I was talking to the landlord about some packed lunch that I needed the next day. I was planning a short excursion by myself to a group of caves nearby. The landlord was in a hurry, arranging things for a new guest who had booked a room for the season and was supposed to be moving in any moment, arriving by the mail train. Their plan worked out very well. So one day the narrator wanted to visit some caves nearby. He asked from the landlord some lunch packet. At the same time, the landlord was busy arranging room and things for the new guest who would be arriving soon by the mail train. And the words that we need to learn here are excursion, which means a short visit or trip. Mail train means a fast train that carries mail. Let us continue with the story. And sure enough, soon as a young man came in, a porter carrying his luggage. He was barely 25, clad in an ill-fitting tweed suit with drooping shoulders and white trouser buttons. Because of the journey, he looked untidy. His hair, his necktie, his shoes, all unkempt and needing attention. But he had a cheerful face and jet black eyes sparkling with vitality. The difficult words that we need to learn here are barely, which means hardly, only just. Clad means dressed, wearing. Ill-fitting, about a garment is of a wrong size. Tweed suit means suit made of a rough woolen fabric. Drooping means bent. Unkept means shabby, messy. Vitality means life or energy. Here we see the new guest coming in. He was a young guest who was hardly 25. His luggage was carried by a porter. He wore a suit which is of a wrong size with the bent shoulders. And because of the journey, he looks untidy, including his hair, his necktie, his shoes. But in spite of his unpleasant outward appearance, yet he had a cheerful face with sparkling eyes full of energy. Mr. Bhandari stepped forward and asked, "Mr. David, I presume?" The young man looked closely at his face, smiled, and nodded. "Room number 18, please. Everything is ready." The young man again looked at him, smiled, and nodded. He paid the porter, who bowed low, for he was not asked to return the change, and disappeared. The young man gave me a brief, friendly look and sat before a huge book which the landlord had pushed before him, making the necessary entries about himself and his intended stay. The words that we need to learn here are presume, which means suppose or assume. Intended means planned or intentional. So after looking at the new guest, the young man nodded his head. When Mr. Bhandari said that the room was ready, the young man again nodded his head. He paid the porter, and the porter bowed his head to show his thankfulness, because he was asked to keep the change, and left happily. The young man gave a friendly look to the narrator and then sat down to enter the details of his stay in the huge book which the landlord had given him to enter. At this time he discovered the sealed envelope containing the typed chit lying on the table, addressed to him by name. He took the cover and tore it open. This coincided with the entry of the landlady into the room. She hurriedly asked her husband if this was the new guest, and having received confirmation, came forward and shook hands with the young man. "Would you like to have a hot bath immediately or tea first?" The young man pursed his lips and shrugged his shoulders, obviously implying that one would be as good as the other and that he had no preferences. The words we need to learn here are coincided, which means to happen at the same time. Non pursed his lips, means to bring lips tightly together in a rounded form. Shrugged means raised and contracted. Implying means to indicate meaning. So while he was writing the entry, he saw his envelope bearing his name and he opened it to read. At that moment, the landlady entered and inquired from her husband whether he is the guest who intended to stay. After getting the confirmation, she greeted him and asked him if he would like to have hot bath first or hot tea. The young man did not reply, but he just moved his lips and shoulder that he would like any of these two. Both the landlord and the landlady were by now slightly disconcerted by what they inferred to be their guest's pride and arrogance, since he had not even deigned to reply adequately to their polite inquiries. The young man meanwhile took out the typed chit and started reading it. As soon as he gone through it, he looked around astonished. The little girl Pramodini was playing in the courtyard at the moment. He could see her sitting near the flower beds. The young man looked at all of us with a smile and darted out towards her. The words that we need to learn here are disconcerted, which means confused. Inferred means conclude or understand. Deigned means thought fit to do something. Adequately means to be satisfactory or acceptable. Darted out means to move quickly out to something. When Mr. David here did not answer to the question, the Bandaris were feeling confused and at the same time they were feeling ashamed. They concluded that their new guest is a very proud and haughty man. Meanwhile, when he read the chit and he looked around and saw Pramodini in the courtyard playing, he at once went to her. "Now this is very strange," Mrs. Bandari cried out in protest. "How rude he is! He shouldn't have ignored our request like this." The landlord put in more mildly. After a few moments, we all walked out to the veranda, and I was apprehensive of that impending look of anguish on the faces of the parents and the child. The scene that confronted us was something we least expected. The strange young man was reclining on the grassy ground and Pramodini was sitting on his lap. He was showing her the flowers. The words that we need to learn here: apprehensive, which means worried; impending, about to happen; confronted, to see or approach; reclining means lying back in a relaxed position. So here when Mr. David did not consider the request of the parents to wait for the girl to be familiar with the guest, Mrs. Bandari cried out that he is a rude person. Her husband also felt the same. But when they went to the veranda, they were surprised to see just the opposite of what they were expecting. They saw Mr. David was sitting on the grass and their daughter sat on his lap. He was showing her a flower. And suddenly, like the sound of a gun exploding, the shrill animal-like laughter of Pramodini pierced the air. The parents looked at each other with wonder and amazement. "Our daughter has not laughed like this for years," Mrs. Bandari said. Curious, we watched the two of them who were now walking towards us hand in hand. Pramodini ran to her mother and danced about her with joy. She made her queer sounds of "Mama, Mama," and mildly pointed to the young man. The words that we need to learn here are very few. Pierced the air means forced through the air. Curious means eager to know. Queer means strange or something unusual. So here we have that as the parents and the narrator were watching the two, they suddenly heard like a gun exploding and the high-pitched sound of Pramodini. The parents were surprised and curious as to what happened to her. They have not heard their daughter laughing in this way. Mr. David and their daughter walked towards them, and Pramodini ran to the mother, danced around her, hugged her, and called her Mama, as she pointed out to the young man. It was Mr. David who came to our rescue. We soon realized that he was deaf and dumb too. His strange, ambiguous silence, his sudden rush for the girl on reading the note, all became instantly clear to us. It took us time to digest the news. And then both parents broke into incoherent statements of profuse apologies that they had not noticed it earlier. Imagining the type of man they were talking to, they spoke in half sentences and tried to convey the rest through gestures. He gracefully acknowledged their warmth and either nodded or shook his head in reply. For more complicated and lengthy answers, he used pen and paper. Now, the words that we need to learn here are ambiguous, which means uncertain or not clear. Incoherent means not easily understood. Digest means understand. Gracefully means in a respectful way. Acknowledge means accept or admit. The parents of the girls realized that Mr. David himself was deaf and dumb. The man whom they thought is a very rude and ill-mannered man became their savior. They now realized the reason behind his strange behavior. His empty silence, his sudden rush to see the girl after reading the note, and both parents apologized Mr. David for misunderstanding him. Knowing that he was deaf and dumb, they spoke to him in half sentence and tried to convey the rest of the message through gestures. Mr. David gracefully accepted their apology and their gratitude by nodding or by shaking his head in reply, and for a complicated answer he wrote in a piece of paper. The next day Mrs. Bhandari was full of news. She talked as she had never talked before. She mentioned the stranger and the plans for the betterment of Pramodini he had outlined to her and her husband. There were schools for such people, he had told them, though they were beyond most people's means. He had himself been educated in one such institution abroad and had now returned to India to render the same useful service to others by starting a school here. She almost broke down with gratitude, and when she said that he had agreed to accept Pramodini as his first pupil, Mrs. Bhandari laughed like a carefree girl. She gave us an extra helping of jam and butter and honey at the table. She looked the happiest woman in the world. The words that we need to learn here are mentioned, that means refer to something, briefly and without going into detail. Outline means give a summary or details. Means, that means financially resources. Abroad to a foreign country. Broke down means to be unable to control the feelings. Extra helping of means being more than what is usual. Mrs. Bhandari was full of excitement about the story of Mr. David and her daughter. She kept on talking all the time. She spoke about the future plan of Pramodini that was planned out by the young man. The young man spoke about the school for deaf and dumb, which is beyond the financial status of the people. That means there are people who are not able to have lots of money to send their children to these schools. The young man had studied abroad, and in returning to India, he wanted to serve to those people who are in need, like Pramodini, by starting a school there. Mrs. Bhandari was extremely glad to know that the young man is going to take Pramodini as his first student. With this news, Mrs. Bhandari was so happy that she gave them extra things to eat. She became the happiest person in the world that day. So, the name of the story, The Silver Lining, is true to its name. This story brought hope to the couples and to their daughter. So, dear students, life is very tough, but remember, in every difficulties and every problem, there is always hope. So, let us always hope for the better. May God bless you and be with you always, and fill your life with silver linings in all your dark clouds.